Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to begin with a story that feels more like a dark fairy tale than a real-life account. But everything you're about to hear happened historically documented, medically baffling, and morally unsettling. It's the story of a boy born into power, yet trapped in a body so deformed that people whispered he had been cursed by witches. His name was Charles II of Spain. And if you've never heard of him, well, buckle in. Because Charles wasn't just any king, he was the last of a cursed dynasty. The final flickering candle of a line that had been marrying its cousins for centuries until the flame sputtered out with a fizzle and possibly a little sulfur. So let's rewind to Madrid, 1661. A prince is born to King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. That sounds normal enough. Except here's the twist. Philip and Mariana were uncle and niece. Yes, you read that right. Their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a braid. The Habsburgs, desperate to preserve the purity of their bloodline, had been marrying their relatives for generations. Cousins, uncles, nieces, it didn't matter. As long as it stayed in the family. Unfortunately, nature doesn't take kindly to such creative genealogy, and Charles was the living proof of that. From the moment he was born, it was clear something was wrong. He didn't cry like other babies. He didn't move right. His tongue was so large and swollen that he couldn't close his mouth properly, and when he tried to speak, his words were incomprehensible. His jaw jutted out in the classic Habsburg chin, a family trait that had gone from noble feature to medical catastrophe. His head was disproportionately large, his legs weak, his coordination non-existent. He didn't learn to walk until age 4. He didn't speak intelligibly until nearly 8. Some observers described him as more like a puppet than a person. But in 17th century Spain, no one would dare suggest that the royal family's breeding habits were to blame. Instead, they turned to more spiritual explanations. Whispers began spreading in the court. Surely, they said, this couldn't be natural. Maybe the queen had angered a sorceress. Maybe someone had placed a hex on the newborn prince. After all, what else could explain such a tragic figure wrapped in silk and gold? Rather than seek medical understanding, the royal household turned to exorcisms. Yes, exorcisms. Holy men were brought in to pray over Charles, to anoint him with holy water, to cast out any demons or spirits that might have taken up residence in his tiny, trembling body. And while the church whispered prayers, the physicians stood by helpless, trying poultices, leeches, and various medieval nonsense to no avail. Charles was a medical mystery, and in the absence of knowledge, fear and folklore filled the void. As Charles grew well, grew as generous. His physical development stalled. He remained short, frail, and dependent on others. But the Habsburgs needed an heir, and so the boy who could barely speak was declared king at the age of 4 when his father died. Picture that. A toddler, unable to hold a spoon properly, now wearing a crown too heavy for his head. The regency was passed to his mother, Mariana, who essentially ruled on his behalf for years. But even when Charles technically came of age, nothing really changed. He was still largely incapable of ruling. Documents had to be read to him aloud, explained slowly, and sometimes repeated multiple times. He signed papers he barely understood. Ministers came and went, each vying for control of the shadow throne while the king sat beside them, drooling slightly and blinking slowly. But the rumors never stopped. In fact, they grew louder. Some courtiers believed Charles was the victim of a demonic curse. Others thought he was a changeling, swapped at birth by fairies. One disturbing theory claimed that his deformities were the punishment of God for the sins of the Habsburg line. And in a time when witch hunts were common and reason scarce, these weren't just stories, they were policy-driving fears. When Charles's health declined, which it often did, the court didn't just call for physicians. They also summoned exorcists. There are records of at least a dozen attempts to cast out demons from the king. In one account, a priest claimed to see the devil hiding behind Charles's bed curtains. Another insisted he saw the king's eyes glow red during a seizure. To be fair, that last one might just have been a candle flickering. But in a palace built on paranoia, perception was reality. You might wonder, was Charles aware of any of this? That's the haunting part. All accounts suggest that, despite his developmental delays, Charles had enough self-awareness to realize how people saw him. He knew he was different. He knew people feared him. He even apologized once to a visiting noble for being so little and so disfigured. That's not something a man says unless he's painfully aware of the eyes that follow him and the whispers behind closed doors. But perhaps the cruelest twist was this. Despite his body failing him in every way, Charles was still expected to carry out royal duties, including producing an heir. He was married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, reportedly cried on their wedding night and tried to avoid physical contact at all costs. The second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Charles was sterile, likely due to genetic defects, and thus, the dynasty's desperate grip on power ended where it had begun, in a union so inbred that nature itself said, enough. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because the tale of the cursed king isn't just about one man. It's about a kingdom unraveling, about an empire that placed superstition over science, pride over prudence, and paid the price. After decades of ruling from behind a veil of incense smoke and whispered prayers, Charles II's body was failing. But the Spanish Empire around him was not doing much better. His reign saw economic collapse, rampant inflation, widespread famine, and a general sense that Spain, the once glorious master of the seas, was now drifting aimlessly, rudderless, and haunted by a king who could barely speak above a mumble. At this point, his very existence seemed more symbolic than practical. He was the human embodiment of a decaying empire, fragile, slow, and visibly cracking under the weight of centuries of poor decisions. Yet, as if his deteriorating health and obvious incapacity weren't tragic enough, the political climate only made things worse. Spain's enemies were circling, and so were its allies. Everyone wanted to know one thing: what happens when Charles dies? Because here's the catch: he had no children. The Habsburg bloodline in Spain was about to end, and every major power in Europe wanted a piece of the inheritance. France and Austria in particular were drooling over Spain's colonies, ports, and precious trade routes like wolves watching an old, limping deer. So now the court, which had spent years praying to keep Charles alive, began to shift their prayers toward strategy. Who would succeed him? Who could be trusted not to plunge Europe into war over his empire? Charles himself, despite his severe mental and physical impairments, was surprisingly aware of the stakes. He insisted multiple times that he wanted a Spanish successor, someone who could continue the line even if he couldn't. But fate and genetics had other plans. Behind closed doors, Charles's court was descending into chaos. Ministers were bribed, alliances were forged and broken in secret, and foreign ambassadors wrote panicked letters home. What should have been a dignified final chapter of a dynasty became a diplomatic game of musical chairs with a dying king as the centerpiece. But there was one other player in this political theater who may have had more influence than anyone dared admit: the Church. Remember, this was the age of the Inquisition, not the metaphorical one where people are judged on social media, but the real, terrifying one where people were literally burned alive for suspicion of heresy. In this world, Charles's deformities weren't just unfortunate, they were dangerous. They were considered signs of divine punishment, and that made him not just a weak king, but a potential theological crisis. The Spanish Inquisition, which had an almost cartoonish level of control over the nation's private and public life, became increasingly involved in Charles's health. Priests and monks, rather than doctors, were summoned to attend his bedside. When he suffered seizures or violent mood swings, they didn't ask what medicine can help. They asked, which sin caused this? Or more disturbingly, who bewitched the king? In fact, one of the most infamous cases during Charles's life was the accusation that a nun, Sor Maria de Agreda, had bewitched him. Though she had died years before, her letters were preserved and scrutinized, and her name was dragged through the mud by officials desperate to pin the king's condition on someone. You might think this was an act of desperation, but to them, it was reasoned theology. A cursed king needed a source of the curse, and it was easier to blame a dead woman than admit centuries of inbreeding might have had something to do with it. Things became even stranger in the final years of his life. Charles's physicians, who were now mostly figureheads, reported that the king's body had taken on an unnatural hue, his skin turning pale and almost translucent. His hair fell out in patches, his eyes grew sunken, and he began to lose his teeth at an alarming rate. There's one record of his urine being described as dark as ink. And yet, through it all, he remained king, not because anyone thought he was competent, but because removing him would cause a power vacuum so explosive that no one dared try. So instead, Spain limped on, led by a man who couldn't chew solid food and whose advisors were debating whether his soul had been replaced by demons. And here's where things get even more grotesque. Upon his death in 1700, an autopsy was performed not because they hoped to learn something, but because they were hoping to confirm their suspicions. The report is still one of the most disturbing pieces of royal medical history ever written. His body was so deteriorated that the royal physician reportedly wrote, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous and putrid. He had a single testicle black as coal, and his head was full of water. Historians still debate the accuracy of these claims, But if even half of that is true, it's astonishing he lived past age 30, let alone to the age of 38. It's easy to see why people turn to witchcraft to explain him. His body was practically a walking horror story, but that explanation, however dramatic, distracts from the real villain of this story. Centuries of deliberate, politically motivated inbreeding. The Habsburg dynasty had created the perfect genetic storm by refusing to marry outside their small royal circle. Charles wasn't a fluke. He was the mathematical outcome of a deeply flawed family policy. In fact, recent genetic analyses show that Charles II had more inbreeding than the average child of siblings. Wrap your head around that for a second. But here's the most heartbreaking part. Charles never asked for any of this. He didn't choose his birth, his deformities, or the crushing weight of empire that was dropped on his misshapen shoulders. Despite his obvious suffering, he still tried. He wrote letters, tried to engage with politics, made alliances, and hoped. In vain. For children, he tried to be king, even though the world around him decided he was cursed, defective, or damned. When he finally died, the War of Spanish Succession broke out, a bloody conflict that pulled in almost every major power in Europe. So, in the end, even in death, Charles II couldn't find peace. His body was buried, his kingdom shattered, and the dynasty erased. But his story remains, not just as a curiosity of history, but as a grotesque mirror, one that reflects what happens when superstition replaces science, when power replaces compassion, and when tradition devours its own legacy. It might be comforting to think that Charles II's story ended quietly in a candlelit chamber, with priests murmuring prayers as his malformed body exhaled one last time. But nothing about Charles's life or death was quiet. His final years were a macabre theater of desperation. Ministers argued over who should inherit his throne while he was still alive, standing just out of earshot as if he were already a corpse. Foreign spies jostled for influence at court, and his second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, doubled down on the theory that her husband was the victim of dark magic. She reportedly accused multiple courtiers of sorcery and spent much of her time commissioning religious rituals rather than offering political counsel. The Spanish court had become less a center of empire and more a Gothic sideshow. Charles himself, increasingly ill and aware that his days were numbered, took one last dramatic step. He named his successor, and in a twist that shocked Europe, he chose Philip of Anjou, the 17-year-old grandson of Louis XIV of France. It was a political grenade. The other powers of Europe had been watching Spain like vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. Now, with a Bourbon prince positioned to take the Spanish crown, the delicate balance of European power tilted sharply toward France. When Charles died in 1700, his death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an empire's illusion of stability. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted like a thunderclap, lasting over a decade and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, all because of a single signature, scrawled with a shaky hand by a dying king who had never truly ruled. But let's rewind for a moment, because there's one question that still haunts historians, physicians, and the curious-minded alike. What exactly was wrong with Charles II? For centuries, scholars could only guess. Now, with the help of genetic research and retrospective diagnosis, we have a clearer, though no less horrifying picture. Charles was likely suffering from multiple inherited conditions. One major candidate is combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his delayed development, infertility, and stunted growth. Another is hydrocephalus fluid buildup in the brain, which aligns with the autopsy's description of his head full of water. And then there's mandibular prognathism, better known as the infamous Habsburg jaw, which was so severe in Charles that he reportedly had to push food to the back of his throat with his fingers in order to swallow. What's even more chilling is the role of incest coefficients. Modern geneticists estimate that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of over 0.25. That's equivalent to being the child of siblings. Let that sink in. Generations of cousin marriage had compacted the Habsburg gene pool to such an extent that Charles's genetic diversity was functionally non-existent. He was a walking recessive gene lottery, and unfortunately, he hit the jackpot in all the worst ways. But Charles didn't just inherit broken chromosomes. He inherited the immense expectations of an empire that refused to evolve. Spain, once the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, had grown rigid, clinging to outdated traditions and religious fanaticism. Its economy was stunted by monopolies and endless wars. Its colonies were hemorrhaging resources faster than they could replenish them. And yet, in this state of crisis, the country chose to place its fate in the hands of a man who could barely walk unaided. Some may argue Charles was merely a symbol, a placeholder, a royal mascot paraded out during festivals and hidden away the rest of the year. But that does a disservice to the complex, painful role he played. Charles may not have wielded power with intellect or charisma, but his suffering was real, and the decisions made in his name had real consequences. There's also the strange matter of Charles's personal beliefs. Despite being treated as a cursed object by much of his court, Charles was deeply religious, perhaps obsessively so. He attended Mass regularly, confessed constantly, and surrounded himself with relics, icons, and holy items. Some historians interpret this as genuine faith. Others believe it was a desperate attempt to gain control over his failing body, to find meaning in a life that had been reduced to pity and prayer. After all, when the world treats you as monstrous, it makes sense to search for redemption in the supernatural. Even more telling is the way Charles tried, in his own limited way, to leave a legacy. He clung to the hope of fatherhood far longer than anyone around him thought realistic. He publicly praised his wives, even as they distanced themselves from him. He commissioned portraits that flattered him, though artists had to work hard to downplay the dramatic overbite and gaunt features. And he insisted, up to his last days, that Spain would remain independent. Perhaps he didn't understand the full scope of the alliances and treaties swirling around his name, but he understood that his body had become political real estate. And therein lies the real tragedy. Charles II was never just a person. He was a battlefield genetic, political, spiritual. His body bore the weight of an empire's pride and the consequences of its isolation. His reign was marked not by accomplishments, but by a slow-motion collapse that everyone saw coming and no one could stop. When he finally died on November 1st, 1700, the public reaction was a mix of grief, relief, and morbid curiosity. The streets of Madrid filled with speculation. Did he die peacefully? Was there a final curse? Did his soul ascend? Or had it been long gone already? His body, already frail, was embalmed and displayed. Some say the smell was unbearable even after hours. Others whispered that his corpse twisted slightly, as if trying to speak one last time. But these are just legends, echoes of a life defined by myth as much as fact. What isn't legend is the aftermath. Spain was torn apart. The war that followed claimed more than land, it reshaped Europe. And in the vacuum left by the last Habsburg king of Spain, new dynasties rose, new ideas bloomed, and slowly, the world began to move forward. Charles II was the full stop at the end of a long, convoluted sentence, one written in gold ink, smeared with blood, and annotated in superstition. So next time you hear someone joke about inbreeding or dismiss old monarchies as quirky relics of the past, remember Charles. Remember the man who couldn't chew food, couldn't have children, and still sat atop an empire. Not because he was powerful, but because the people around him were too afraid to admit the system had failed. As strange as it may sound, the legacy of Charles II of Spain didn't end with his burial, or even with the war that followed. His memory, distorted and mythologized, continued to haunt both the Spanish people and the European imagination. Over the centuries, writers, historians, painters, and eventually filmmakers would return to his image not as a ruler to be admired, but as a tragic curiosity. He became a symbol of what happens when arrogance meets biology, when superstition overrides science, and when power is preserved for its own sake long after it has ceased to serve anyone. There's a portrait of Charles painted near the end of his life. If you look closely, you'll see a gaunt figure with a jaw that juts out so far it nearly touches his chest. Pale skin almost translucent, eyes wide and watery, as if unsure where to look. His regal clothing can't disguise the physical frailty beneath. His crown is on the table beside him, not on his head as though even the artist understood it was a burden too heavy to wear. It's the image of a man born into majesty but cursed by lineage, and it tells a more honest story than most royal portraits dare to. What's particularly tragic is that Charles wasn't evil, nor cruel. There are no records of tyranny, no massacres in his name, no purges or grandiose ambitions. He didn't rage or rant or wage bloody wars for glory. Instead, he endured. That might sound unimpressive, but in a world that never allowed him to live as a normal human being, much less a king, endurance is, perhaps, the most noble thing he did. It's easy to look at Charles as a cautionary tale about genetics, about the perils of keeping bloodlines pure, or the damage that insular power structures can do to human beings. And it is all of those things. But it's also about how people respond to what they don't understand. Charles's court was filled with the most educated people of their time, statesmen, clerics, scholars. And yet, rather than confront the obvious medical realities of his condition, they created stories. He was cursed. He was bewitched. The devil had taken his soul. The blame was always pushed outward toward heretics, foreigners, witches anywhere but inward, toward the monarchy's own choices. This isn't just a relic of the past. Even now, when faced with tragedy or deformity, people often reach for mythology before medicine. They blame fate, karma, curses. It's easier, safer. But Charles's story shows us the cost of that denial. His was a life spent in the shadow of misunderstanding a misunderstood body, misunderstood mind, misunderstood soul. And because no one was willing to look clearly at the causes, nothing changed until it was far too late. There's also something deeply uncomfortable about how Charles's suffering was public property. His body wasn't just his own, it was Spain's, Europe's, the church's. His symptoms were interpreted like omens. When he was well, it was a sign from God. When he was ill, it was proof of sin. People examined him, prodded him, diagnosed him from afar without ever asking what he thought. His marriages weren't about love. They were diplomatic experiments. His faith wasn't personal. It was a performance. His death wasn't private. It was an international crisis. In the end, he belonged to everyone except himself. There are records of Charles asking, in his final year, whether he had done anything good in his reign. It's a heartbreaking question, because the truth is he probably didn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was never truly allowed to. He was surrounded, from birth to death, by handlers, advisors, confessors, physicians, and politicians who used his name while ignoring his voice. He was a man silenced not by law but by deformity, expectation, and centuries of royal inertia. And yet, there's something quietly heroic in the fact that he kept trying. He tried to learn. He tried to govern. He tried to have children. He tried to leave a will that he thought would preserve peace. It didn't work, but it wasn't because he didn't care. That effort, however fumbling, is perhaps the only power he truly had. And for a man so often treated like a living corpse, that's not nothing. As the war raged after his death and Europe tore itself apart over the inheritance of his broken crown, Charles's name began to fade. He was mentioned less in political documents and more in whispered stories. His autopsy became a macabre footnote. His portraits were hidden in less traveled halls. And eventually, he was remembered more as a warning than as a man. Even today, in Spain, he's a controversial figure. Some history textbooks skim over his reign, calling it a period of decline without delving into why. Others focus on the genetics, the war, the politics, but few talk about the human being behind all that. The child who never really got to be a child. The man who wanted love, peace, and healing, and got instead incense, suspicion, and pity, and perhaps the most poetic irony of all. The empire that worked so hard to protect its bloodline, to preserve its purity, to defy change ended with Charles. The very thing they feared outside influence became inevitable the moment he took his last breath. Spain would go on, of course, but not as it was. It would be reshaped by foreign monarchs, foreign wars, and a slowly dawning realization that insularity leads not to strength, but to stagnation. So the next time you hear about royal grandeur or ancient bloodlines, remember Charles II. Remember that the cost of that grandeur is often hidden in the shadows, sometimes in malformed limbs, misunderstood minds, and silent, desperate hearts. He didn't rule like a king, perhaps, but he suffered like a human. And in a world that valued perfection more than compassion, that's what makes him unforgettable. By now, you've probably formed a vivid mental image of Charles II, the twisted jaw, the limp gait, the sad eyes hidden beneath royal finery. But the more you stare into the portrait of this broken king, the more you start to realize that what you're looking at isn't just a man, it's a culmination. A biological conclusion to centuries of royal ego and institutional denial. Charles didn't appear out of nowhere. He was forged in the fires of dynastic pride, sculpted by generations of calculated incest and political paranoia. If ever a single human being represented the physical embodiment of an empire's slow collapse, it was him. And yet, in spite of everything, the grotesque physical challenges, the whispered rumors, the ceremonial exorcisms, he still held the throne for 35 years. Yes, most of that time he was more of a figurehead than a functional monarch. But the sheer fact of his continued survival is, in some twisted way, a miracle. Or at least, a testimony to the stubborn machinery of monarchy. Because what happens when a king can't speak clearly, can't produce an heir, can't ride a horse, or lead a war? Well, you just pretend he can. You prop him up, literally if necessary, and keep going. The daily routines of Charles's court bordered on surreal. Mornings began with elaborate rituals. Dressing the king took nearly an hour, with layers of lace, velvet, and brocade that he couldn't put on himself. Multiple servants were required just to help him stand and shuffle to his chair. Meals were prepared with extreme care, but his oversized jaw made chewing nearly impossible. He often swallowed food whole or had it mashed into a paste. Conversations were one-sided, with courtiers waiting patiently for him to form a thought, which he would deliver in a slurred whisper, sometimes needing to be repeated or translated by those who understood his patterns. It would have been easier to lock him away, to place him in a secluded palace and declare a regent permanently in charge, but appearances mattered. Spain was still an empire, and empires needed a monarch, not a ghost, and so Charles was paraded through ceremonies. Portraits were commissioned to make him look slightly less alarming, and foreign dignitaries were forced to pretend that his wheezing speech and dull gaze were signs of deep wisdom. Diplomacy, after all, is the art of saying this is fine while everything is on fire. There's a particularly bizarre episode from the 1690s that shows how far the illusion had to stretch. A delegation from the Papal States came to Madrid, and Charles was scheduled to meet them in the throne room. He was late, very late. Whispers passed down the hall that he had suffered a seizure, or perhaps a nervous breakdown. But instead of canceling the audience, his handlers simply delayed, offered refreshments, and waited until Charles could be dressed, upright, and minimally coherent. When he finally arrived, he reportedly walked only a few steps before collapsing into a chair. The visiting cardinal, unsure how to respond, took this as a sign of reverent humility. Everyone smiled politely, and no one said a word. This sort of performance happened constantly, and over time, people got used to it. The absurdity became routine. The empire adjusted around the king's deformities like a castle built on sand, wobbly, fragile, but somehow still standing. Meanwhile, Spain itself was falling behind. Its military was outdated. Its economy was riddled with debt. Its colonies were restless. But as long as the crown was worn, even by someone who barely understood what it meant, the illusion of power endured. Charles's personal relationships weren't any easier. His 2 marriages were political arrangements, designed to produce heirs and soothe international alliances, but neither bore fruit. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was young, cultured, and according to letters, desperately unhappy. She reportedly wept on her wedding night and suffered multiple health crises. Possibly due to the stress of her situation, she died young. And though some blamed illness, others whispered she had simply given up the will to live. Charles was said to be genuinely distraught, but also confused. It's unclear whether he ever fully grasped the depth of her sadness. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, came from a family of prolific fertility. Her sisters had borne dozens of children, but even she couldn't break the curse. After a few failed pregnancies, she too began to believe that something unnatural was at work. She pushed for more exorcisms, more masses, more holy relics placed in the royal bedroom. At one point, she even blamed certain court officials for using black magic to dry up the king's seed. In any other setting, this would be tabloid nonsense. In 17th century Spain, it was state policy. Charles, for his part, seemed to fluctuate between bewilderment and genuine hope. There are documents in which he writes of his desire to be a father, to raise a child, to see the Habsburg name continue. He was surrounded by advisors and priests telling him it was possible, that miracles happened, that the Virgin Mary could intervene, and so he believed. Or perhaps he just wanted to believe. After all, when your life has been defined by affliction, the idea of divine redemption starts to sound like the only reasonable explanation left. Meanwhile, in the shadows, the great powers of Europe kept plotting. Louis XIV of France, always the opportunist, saw Charles's infertility not as a tragedy, but as an opening. He began positioning his grandson, Philip, as the logical heir. Austria, on the other hand, insisted on their own claim, citing blood ties and traditional succession rights. England, the Dutch Republic, and others all had opinions, interests, and armies ready. And through it all, Charles sat on his throne dressed in brocade, face pale, mind foggy, body aching, completely unaware that the war of his succession had already begun. He was the last king of Spain's Habsburg line, the last flicker of a genetic experiment gone horribly, fascinatingly wrong, and everyone knew it. Ministers scrambled to secure alliances. Courtiers placed bets on which heir would be named. Foreign diplomats smiled through clenched teeth. And Charles, with what little energy he had left, tried to write his will. His signature was shaky, almost illegible, but it was enough to ignite a war. A man who could barely feed himself started a conflict that would reshape Europe for generations. Not with speeches, not with soldiers, but with the simple, tragic reality of his biology. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that the weakest among us often set off the largest avalanches. And Charles II, barely capable of standing unaided and reportedly so thin and pale, he resembled a living corpse, was no exception. His death in 1700 may have been quiet, no dramatic final words. No public collapse during a grand parade, but the ripples it caused turned into tidal waves. Europe was already bracing for the inevitable. In fact, many rulers had quietly prepared armies even before the royal physicians announced the king had finally succumbed to what they called natural causes. Though the reality was far more complex. When word of Charles's death spread, it wasn't met with grief so much as calculation. In Madrid, nobles gathered not to mourn, but to figure out who among them would align with which foreign prince. In Paris, Louis XIV reportedly smiled and announced, "The Pyrenees no longer exist," a dramatic way of saying he expected French and Spanish interests to merge. In Vienna, there was outrage. The Austrians, being Habsburgs themselves, believed the Spanish crown belonged to them by blood, but Charles had willed it otherwise. And that set the match to the powder keg. The War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted over a decade, drew in nearly every major European power and devastated entire regions. It wasn't just about territory, it was about legacy, pride, and the control of trade routes, colonies, and influence across continents. And it all began with the death of a man who had spent his life being told he was cursed, broken, and useless. In a way, Charles had the last laugh. They all underestimated him. And yet, in dying, he wielded more influence than he ever had in life. But the war is only part of the story. What's equally fascinating, perhaps even more so, is how Charles II became a cultural symbol in the centuries that followed. In Spanish popular memory, he remained El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Even today, school children in Spain know the nickname, though not always the details. He's mentioned in textbooks not for policies or achievements, but as an example of decline, the dark end of the Habsburg line. And depending on the storyteller, he's either pitiful or monstrous, cursed or cursed others, a symbol of human suffering or divine punishment. In other parts of Europe, he became a kind of grotesque curiosity. Enlightenment thinkers, fascinated by anatomy and heredity, pored over the autopsy report with morbid glee. Artists painted exaggerated caricatures of his face, complete with the infamous jaw and bulging eyes. In medical journals of the 18th and 19th centuries, Charles was frequently cited in discussions of inbreeding and hereditary disease, his reign reduced to a case study with footnotes. The man who once held the entire Spanish Empire in his hands had become a textbook example of what not to do with your family tree. But over time, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. Historians in the 20th century, especially after the rise of genetics as a science, started to reevaluate Charles not as a horror story, but as a victim. He wasn't a failure because he was stupid or cruel or weak-willed. He was a failure because the system around him was rigged from the start, a system that valued royal blood over basic health, that saw the throne as more sacred than the people who sat on it, and that was so obsessed with tradition and prestige that it couldn't see its own doom approaching, even as it stared it in the face every time Charles entered the room. And yet, even in this reevaluation, Charles still haunts us. There's something deeply unsettling about his story. Beyond the physical deformities or the creepy court rituals, it's the way he was used, the way everyone from priests to politicians to relatives saw his suffering not as something to ease, but as something to exploit or explain away. He was the ultimate royal puppet, his strings pulled by dozens of hands, none of which ever truly cared about the boy inside the broken shell. It's easy, in hindsight, to say they should have known better, but superstition is a powerful drug, especially when combined with power. In the 1600s, a malformed king wasn't just a medical anomaly, he was a theological puzzle. How could God allow this? Was it a punishment? A warning? A sign of the end times? People needed answers, and they often reached for the most dramatic ones available, which is why stories of curses and witchcraft didn't fade with his death. They intensified. In fact, some of the most bizarre rumors about Charles came after he was buried. There were whispers that his body didn't decompose, that it emitted strange smells, sometimes fragrant, sometimes sulfurous. One story claimed that a servant who touched the king's corpse went blind. Another, even more absurd, insisted that his body had been replaced with a wax figure and that the real Charles had been taken away by angels or demons, depending on who was telling the tale. In short, Charles became a legend, a dark fairy tale passed down through generations. Less a man and more a warning. Of course, not all the legends were unkind. In some rural parts of Spain, he was remembered as a gentle soul. Villagers told tales of a king who loved animals, who hated bloodshed, who prayed with such intensity that saints wept. These stories are unverified, of course, but they say something about the human need to reclaim even the most tragic figures, to give them back their dignity, if only in memory. And perhaps that's what Charles II truly deserves. Not pity, not mockery, not even analysis, but recognition. Recognition that he lived a life he never chose, in a body he never asked for, under the weight of expectations no one should have to bear. He wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't a fool. He was just human, damaged. Yes, misunderstood. Certainly, but human nonetheless. So the next time someone talks about royal bloodlines or the glory days of monarchy, you might want to bring up Charles II. Ask them what glory looks like when the cost is a child who can't chew, a man who can't father a child, a ruler who can't even rule. Ask them what it means to sit on a throne when you're treated like a sacred object but not a person. And ask them whether we've really moved on from the kind of thinking that let that happen in the first place. Because Charles's story may be old, but its echoes are not. If there's a single thread that winds through the life of Charles II and ties it all together, it's silence. Not the peaceful, contemplative kind, but the heavy, suffocating silence of things unspoken, questions unanswered, truths deliberately ignored. The silence in the nursery when nurses realized the royal infant wasn't developing as expected. The silence in the corridors of power as ministers avoided acknowledging that their king didn't understand their briefings. The silence between husband and wife in a royal bedchamber that never produced an heir. And finally, the silence around his deathbed when everyone knew that something monumental had ended. But no one could quite say what. What had ended, really, was a worldview. Charles's death was the final breath of a Spain ruled by divine right and bloodline, of a monarchy so isolated and entangled in its own myths that it no longer recognized reality, even when it limped through the throne room wearing a crown. His body wasn't just a host for bad genes, it was a mirror held up to an entire system that had confused sacred with stagnant and tradition with decay. But let's step back and consider what it must have felt like to be Charles. Not the symbol, not the corpse, the boy, the teenager, the man. Imagine knowing that every single person you meet has already judged you before you've spoken, that your face alone makes people uncomfortable, that no one, not your doctors, your priests, your tutors, or even your own parents ever told you the full truth. Imagine growing up in a palace where everyone was afraid of your body and even more afraid of what it represented. That's the tragedy beneath the tragedy, the denial. Charles wasn't shielded from the truth for his sake. He was shielded so others wouldn't have to face what he embodied. If the king was cursed, then Spain was cursed. If the king was broken, then so was the system that produced him. So they cloaked the truth in incense and velvet, in Latin prayers and political ceremony, hoping that if they looked away long enough, reality would fix itself. There are scattered letters, few and mostly secondhand, that suggest Charles had moments of deep introspection. He reportedly asked his confessor whether his condition was a punishment for the sins of his ancestors. He once inquired if God was angry with Spain. Whether these accounts are entirely true or embellished by later writers, they reveal something important. People wanted Charles to be aware, not because it helped him, but because it made his suffering poetic. The broken king questioning the heavens, that's a narrative you can sell. That's Shakespearean. But even if he did have those thoughts, they would have been his alone, because no one answered them. No one had the courage to say, "No, Charles, this wasn't your fault. You were born into a dynasty that cared more about appearances than about people." It's remarkable. Really, how long a society can go pretending that a problem doesn't exist if it's dressed up in gold and guarded by etiquette. And the irony, Charles might have been a better ruler if anyone had just leveled with him. Maybe he wouldn't have been a genius statesman or a fierce military commander, but perhaps he could have governed with some measure of self-awareness. Instead, he was infantilized, spiritually gaslit, and fed just enough hope to keep him compliant. His advisors didn't want a king who thought they wanted a king who obeyed. And Charles, despite his many limitations, obeyed to the bitter end. There's also something disturbingly modern about his story. You can find echoes of Charles in any system that prizes tradition over truth, image over health, lineage over competency, in corporations run by nepotism, in governments ruled by legacy instead of merit, in families that hide illness or difference to preserve reputation. The details may have changed, but the structure remains. A structure that sacrifices the individual for the sake of appearances. A structure that creates a Charles II over and over again. And maybe that's why his story still lingers in the cultural bloodstream. It makes us uncomfortable. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What are we willing to ignore in the name of tradition? How much pain are we willing to inflict just to avoid admitting that a system has failed? How many broken people have we propped up because it was easier than fixing the foundation? In the years after his death, Spain slowly began to modernize, partly by force, thanks to foreign intervention, and partly through necessity. The new Bourbon kings, starting with Philip brought in French administrative styles, reformed the army, and tried to centralize power. But they also inherited a kingdom exhausted, bled dry, and spiritually haunted. You can't kill a myth like Charles's with policy memos. You can only outgrow it. And yet, even as Spain looked to the future, it carried Charles with it. His portraits remained in dusty halls. His name was whispered in debates about health and heredity. His story was reimagined in Gothic novels, political satire, and medical texts. He became a kind of cautionary icon, not for what he did, but for what was done to him. And so here we are, centuries later, still trying to make sense of it, still staring at those watery eyes and that too pale face, wondering whether he understood more than we think or less, wondering whether he ever had a moment of true peace, wondering what kind of man he could have been if he'd been born into a different family, a different time, a different body, because that's the final heartbreak of Charles II. Not that he failed to rule, not that he ended a dynasty, but that we will never really know him, not truly. All we have are fragments, filtered through the biases of those who surrounded him, the agendas of historians, the myths of an empire trying to hide its rot. His voice, quite literally, was barely audible. And yet the silence he left behind roars louder than most. Maybe that's why we keep returning to him, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a desperate need to listen, to hear the whisper behind the curse, the boy behind the king, the person behind the crown. And if we can do that, if we can see him not just as a freak, a failure, or a footnote, but as a human being caught in the gears of power, then maybe, just maybe, we'll learn how not to repeat the mistakes that made him. The story of Charles II, if nothing else, forces us to confront the brutal collision between myth and medicine, between legacy and biology. As Europe marched confidently into the 18th century, with Enlightenment ideals slowly spreading across salons and universities, the world that produced Charles began to look increasingly medieval, superstitious, insular, allergic to self-awareness. And yet, Charles's ghost lingered even in the age of reason, not as a relic to be pitied, but as a profound contradiction, a divine king who was medically inexplicable, a ruler who couldn't rule, and a monarch who died more famous for the shape of his skull than the content of his policies. One of the most chilling aspects of Charles's legacy is how his body long after his death continued to be scrutinized, dissected, and discussed. In the decades following his burial, scientists and physicians obsessed over his remains. The autopsy, likely embellished over time, became a morbid goldmine of detail. A shriveled heart, necrotic intestines, hydrocephalic brain, atrophied genitals. Whether each item is medically precise or symbolic doesn't even matter. The point was clear: Charles wasn't just sick. He was the embodiment of degeneration, a walking diagnosis. And yet this posthumous dissection often ignored the deeper truth, that Charles wasn't just a medical patient, but a political symptom. The Habsburg dynasty didn't simply produce a deformed king, it produced a system so terrified of outside influence, so obsessed with its own imagined purity, that it consumed itself from the inside out. Charles was merely the final chapter of a genetic gamble that had been going on for centuries, a bet that royal blood alone could sustain an empire. That identity mattered more than health. That lineage was worth more than logic. What makes this all the more tragic is that it wasn't inevitable. There were warnings. Earlier, Habsburgs had exhibited signs of genetic strain, mental illness, reproductive issues, physical deformities. But rather than course correct, the dynasty doubled down. Cousin married cousin. Nephew married aunt. In Charles's case, his parents were uncle and niece, giving him a coefficient of inbreeding so high that, by genetic standards, he might as well have been his own sibling. This wasn't love. It wasn't even tradition. It was political strategy, one that ignored basic biology and paid the price in the most human way possible. Charles's broken body was a kind of grim ledger, tallying the cost of centuries of arrogance. And while this story may sound remote, even quaint, the questions it raises are anything but, because long after Charles's bones turned to dust, monarchies continued. Dynasties rose and fell. Bloodlines were still traced with obsessive care. Even today, in the 21st century, there are royal families whose marriages and offspring are tracked like thoroughbred horses. Genetic testing may have replaced superstition, but the fixation remains. Who is fit to rule? Who carries the right name? The right DNA? We tell ourselves we're more enlightened now, that we'd never let another Charles II happen. But are we sure? In a world where appearance is still often mistaken for competence, where tradition is used to justify all manner of cruelty, where systems defend themselves at the expense of individuals, is it really that hard to imagine another voiceless figurehead being propped up for ceremonial purposes? While the real decisions happen behind velvet curtains, Perhaps the only thing that truly separates us from the 17th century is our vocabulary. We no longer say cursed. We say disabled. We no longer speak of demons. We speak of diagnoses. But if we continue to place symbolism above substance, ritual above reform, then we risk repeating the very patterns that led to Charles's sad fate. There's also a deeper, more intimate tragedy to consider, the kind that doesn't fit neatly into history books or scholarly papers. And that's the loneliness, the sheer, crushing isolation of being Charles. Imagine living your entire life surrounded by people who only speak to you out of duty, who pity you, or worse, fear you, who interpret your every action through the lens of your deformities, who treat your body not as something you inhabit, but as something they must manage. Correct? Control. There's something uniquely heartbreaking about the idea of a king, ostensibly the most powerful man in the land, who likely never experienced real friendship, who likely never heard anyone laugh with him, only at him or in his presence, who probably never felt loved for who he was, only tolerated for what he represented. It's the kind of loneliness that can't be cured with priests or physicians. A spiritual loneliness, one that no crown can cover up. And it's worth asking, what would Charles's life have looked like in a different world? Not a utopia, but just a slightly better one. One with fewer mirrors and more empathy, fewer ceremonies and more compassion. Imagine a Charles born into a family that valued health over politics, science over superstition, a family that looked at a child with challenges and said, let's help him live well, rather than let's make him king because we have no other choice. He might have become a scholar, a monk, a musician, something that brought him peace instead of pressure. He might have found love, or at least dignity. He might have been remembered not for his jawline, but for his joy. That version of Charles never existed. But the fact that we can imagine him means we've already taken a step his own society never did. And maybe that's the real lesson here, not about royalty or genetics or politics, but about how we treat those who are different. Do we fear them, worship them, hide them, or do we listen to them, see them, make room for them? The silence that surrounded Charles was a collective failure, a refusal to engage with the truth of his condition, and by extension, the truth of everyone else's complicity. So now, hundreds of years later, we have a choice. We can keep repeating the myths, marveling at the oddities, chuckling at the caricatures, or we can stop, sit with the discomfort, and acknowledge that behind the velvet curtains and the painted portraits, there was a human being, scared, confused, alone, and trying, against impossible odds, to live a life that made sense. He didn't, not really, and that's not on him. That's on us. As we continue to peel back the layers of Charles II's story, it becomes harder to separate the man from the metaphor. His life is so overloaded with symbolism, decay, isolation, superstition, dynastic downfall that the human being inside can sometimes vanish entirely. And maybe that's the final injustice done to Charles, the reduction of his identity to a collection of symptoms, rumors, and consequences. History has made him into a cautionary tale, a grotesque painting, a diagram in a textbook. But behind all that, there was still a man who lived, breathed, hurt, prayed, and hoped. If you were to stand inside the royal palace of Madrid today, where Charles once shuffled down marble halls in stiff brocade, you'd find ornate rooms filled with portraits and relics of grandeur, but no voice echoes there for Charles. No plaque honors his suffering. No inscription tries to explain the cost of keeping a dynasty alive long after it had stopped serving the people it claimed to protect. His legacy lives mostly in whispers pages in books, footnotes in European history, smirking mentions on educational tours. And yet, the air of tragedy remains, as if the walls themselves remember. What's remarkable, though, is how many parallels can still be drawn between Charles's world and ours. His life may have been shaped by the superstitions of the 17th century, but the mechanisms that oppressed him haven't disappeared, they've just evolved. Back then, they called it divine right. Today, we might call it legacy admissions, generational wealth, political dynasties. The faces change, the language modernizes, but the underlying question persists. What happens when power is inherited rather than earned? What happens when a system cares more about preserving itself than protecting the people inside it? Charles was trapped inside that kind of system, literally and metaphorically. His body was failing, and yet it became the centerpiece of national pride. His mind was clouded, but still treated as a vessel of God's authority. At no point did the monarchy stop and ask, is this still working? Is this fair to him? Instead, the machine kept running, oiling its gears with incense and denial. Let's pause and think about one specific detail. Charles's education. It was minimal. He was taught to read late. His comprehension was limited. And yet, no one intervened with real solutions. No one thought to remove the crushing burden of kingship from his shoulders. Instead, the curriculum was simplified. Tutors were selected for their loyalty over their teaching skill, and his deficiencies were attributed to demonic forces. Imagine being a child who can barely sound out the words in a prayer, and being told that it's because Satan has taken root in your brain. That's not just poor education. That's psychological abuse wrapped in piety. And yet, he remained devout. Through everything, Charles held on to his faith, perhaps because it was the only constant in his life. He went to Mass daily, confessed often, surrounded himself with icons and relics. He clung to saints as protectors, to the Virgin Mary as a surrogate mother figure, to the rituals of the Church as a kind of armor against the chaos of his own existence. We can only speculate whether this was genuine belief or a desperate coping mechanism, but either way, it kept him going. In a palace filled with whispers, he found in faith a silence he could bear. What's also fascinating is the way Charles handled his deteriorating condition in his final years. By then, the illusions were harder to maintain. He could no longer walk unassisted. His speech had become nearly incomprehensible, and he suffered from regular seizures. The physicians gave up on real treatment. The priests leaned harder into exorcisms. At one point, it's recorded that more than 30 masses were said in one day for his healing. 30. Imagine lying in bed, shaking, drooling, unable to sit up, while an army of robed men chant prayers over your body not because they believe in recovery, but because they fear what your death will unleash. And they were right to fear. His death was not just the end of a king, it was the end of a world order. But in the moments before that, there must have been a sliver of awareness, a flicker. Did Charles know he was dying? Did he understand that his death would trigger wars, redraw borders, shatter alliances? Or was he thinking something smaller, more human? Did I do enough? Was I loved? Will God forgive me? There's no diary to give us those answers. No final confession scrawled in a shaky hand. All we have are impressions reports written by others, filtered through agendas. And yet, there is one chilling phrase attributed to Charles near the end of his life. When asked if he had any final wishes, he reportedly replied, "I want to rest." That's it. Not a grand speech, not a divine proclamation, just a whisper. I want to rest. And really, who could blame him? He had carried a crown heavier than most of us can imagine, not in gold, but in expectation, fear, and pain. He had been worshipped and pitied, misunderstood and misused. He had endured in ways that aren't visible in portraits or autopsies. And at the end of it all, he wanted only what had been denied to him since birth: peace. It's easy to moralize his story, to package it into a neat lesson. Don't marry your cousin. Don't ignore science. Don't place tradition above truth. And yes, all those things are valid takeaways. But perhaps the more important message is something gentler, quieter, something Charles himself might have appreciated. And that is, listen. Listen to those who struggle. Listen to the signs when systems stop serving the people within them. And most of all, listen to the silences, because sometimes the things no one says are the ones that hurt the most. Charles didn't leave behind speeches or manifestos, but he left behind a question. What happens when a human being is turned into a symbol and then broken under the weight of that symbol? That question still echoes. In boardrooms, in governments, in royal families, and maybe even in your own family. If you've ever watched someone suffer quietly while everyone else looked the other way. So next time you find yourself in a place of power, even a small one, ask yourself, are you listening? Are you seeing the people behind the roles, behind the expectations, behind the masks? Or are you just keeping the machine running, hoping no one notices it's shaking at the foundation? Charles II couldn't stop the machine, but maybe you can. To understand the full gravity of Charles II's legacy, you have to go beyond the political ramifications and genetic horror and look at what his story revealed about the fragility of power itself. For centuries, monarchy had been equated with divine will. Kings weren't just rulers, they were chosen, anointed. Their bodies were supposed to reflect their superiority, their command over nations blessed by God himself. But Charles's body broke that illusion into jagged pieces. He was a walking contradiction, chosen by God, yet rejected by nature. His very existence forced everyone around him to either lie to themselves or question the entire structure holding them aloft. Most chose to lie. There's a peculiar tension in how Charles's court handled his presence. On one hand, they elevated him. He was called His Most Catholic Majesty, a title meant to echo across continents with awe and reverence. On the other hand, they treated him like a delicate artifact never left alone, rarely told the truth, constantly surrounded by handlers, confessors, and caretakers. It was theater. Every public appearance was choreographed. Every royal proclamation ghost-written. The monarch had become a mannequin, a puppet dressed in velvet, used to give the illusion that the throne was still occupied. This duality, reverence, and infantilization was not unique to Charles, but in his case, it was taken to extremes. While other monarchs could hide their weaknesses behind closed doors, Charles's condition was too visible, too undeniable. Every foreign ambassador who met him returned with a report not just on Spain's politics, but on the king's posture, the clarity of his speech, the shape of his skull. He was less a political actor and more a physical curiosity. Diplomacy in Madrid often felt more like visiting a living museum exhibit than negotiating with a sovereign. And yet, these reports often concluded with the same phrase: "He is well-intentioned," as if the diplomats, despite everything they observed, couldn't help but humanize him in the end. There was something in Charles that inspired a strange sort of compassion, perhaps, because he seemed so thoroughly unsuited to the role he was forced into. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't power-hungry. He wasn't corrupt. He was simply there, trapped. And no amount of ritual could disguise that fact forever. Let's talk for a moment about his death. It was not dramatic. No lightning bolt struck the palace. No comet lit up the sky. He died quietly. After years of illness, surrounded by people who were already making plans for a war his passing would ignite, the doctors, still clinging to the idea of divine mystery, couldn't offer a clear cause. The priests performed their last rites, and the court held its breath. Then the candle finally went out, and with it, so did the Habsburg line in Spain. The days that followed were filled not with mourning, but with calculation. Spain's vast empire territories in Europe, the Americas, the Philippines suddenly had no clear ruler. Charles had named Philip of Anjou, the French Bourbon, as his heir. But the Austrian Habsburgs had other ideas. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and various German states were pulled in almost immediately. The War of the Spanish Succession began not with a declaration, but with a vacuum, a silent, unstable space where a king used to be. That silence was loud. It echoed across continents. It redrew borders. It turned allies into enemies and enemies into reluctant partners. And it killed tens of thousands of people, soldiers, civilians, farmers, entire villages caught in the chaos of a war that began because a man who could barely speak was the last representative of a dying dynasty. In a way, it's poetic. Charles, who had spent his life as an object passed from hand to hand, became in death the object over which empires bled. And unlike his ancestors, who waged wars with swords and pride, Charles waged his war simply by existing. He didn't swing a sword. He didn't ride a horse into battle, but he broke Europe open just by failing to survive. And yet, we don't often talk about that part. We talk about the war, the politics, the treaties, but the fact that a single human body, so fragile and misunderstood, could unleash a conflict on that scale, that should give us pause. Because if a system is so brittle that the death of a sick man can shatter it, then maybe the system wasn't that strong to begin with. There's a modern lesson here, buried beneath the wigs and Latin titles. We still build systems around symbols, around people who represent things rather than people who actually do things, CEOs who inherit power without merit, politicians who cling to legacy instead of earning votes, entire organizations built around figureheads who look good on paper but can't function in reality. Charles II wasn't an outlier. He was an exaggerated version of a phenomenon that still exists. And still, despite everything, we are left wondering, did Charles ever understand the impact of his death? Did he know, as his organs failed and his breath shortened, that the world would split open because of him? Or did he slip away the way he lived, confused, exhausted, and held at a polite distance from the truth? Maybe the only real comfort is that Charles finally got the rest he so quietly asked for. After a life of being examined, judged, prayed over, and politicized, he was placed in the ground, in a royal tomb among ancestors who had made him what he was, some out of ambition, others out of ignorance, all out of loyalty to a name. But names can't hold empires together forever. In the centuries that followed, Spain changed. Its monarchy evolved. Its empire shrank. Its people revolted, reformed, rebuilt. But the specter of Charles remained not as a ruler to emulate, but as a moment to remember, a checkpoint in history that says, this is what happens when humanity is stripped away from leadership, when systems consume the very people they were meant to elevate, when bloodlines become more important than basic human dignity. Charles II didn't ask to be born. He didn't choose to be king. He didn't ask for sainthood or scorn. He simply lived as best he could, and that may not be heroic in the traditional sense, but it is profoundly human. In the end, the lesson isn't about royalty or politics or even genetics. It's about empathy, about seeing the person inside the role, about listening to the voice behind the silence, about asking, again and again, not just what someone represents, but who they really are. Charles II was a king, but before that, he was a boy, a son, a patient, a person, and for too long, no one seemed to remember that. After centuries of analysis, ridicule, and medical curiosity, there's something almost revolutionary in trying to simply see Charles II as a person, not as a symbol, not as a warning, but as a human being whose life was shaped warped, even by forces far beyond his control, for all the grotesque fascination with his deformities. His autopsy, his supposed infertility and supernatural curses. Very few accounts have tried to ask, what did he want? What made him smile? What did he fear when the candles were blown out at night and the whispered voices of courtiers faded into silence? The truth is, we don't really know. That silence wasn't just metaphorical, it was institutional. No one wrote down Charles's private reflections. There are no personal letters filled with philosophical musings, no journals of introspection or frustration. What survives are dry legal documents, royal edicts composed by others in his name, and third-party observations of his daily behavior. He drooled often. He was polite but vacant. He prayed constantly. The fragments we do have offer clues, but they're filtered through layers of perception and often cruelty. There's a cruel symmetry to that. A man who struggled to express himself in life is also voiceless in the historical record, and yet, his silence speaks volumes. In the few moments when Charles did assert himself, historians note something remarkable. He was stubborn, not politically cunning, but quietly immovable when he believed in something. When pressure mounted to name an Austrian successor, Charles refused. He insisted on Philip of Anjou, the Bourbon prince, even though it risked inciting a war. He believed, perhaps naively, that a French successor would preserve Spain's independence better than a return to Austrian dominance. Was he manipulated? Probably, but his refusal to change his mind, even when it would have appeased powerful factions, is one of the only genuine political decisions we can reasonably attribute to him, and it was world-shaking. So we're left with a contradiction, a king incapable of governing, who still made one of the most consequential decisions in European history, a man dismissed as an invalid, who chose the very heir that sparked a decade-long war. Some might call it ironic. Others, fitting, but perhaps it's something else entirely. A final assertion of agency from someone who had been denied it his entire life. It's worth remembering that Charles's upbringing didn't just fail to prepare him for kingship, it actively disabled him further. As a child, he wasn't just poorly educated, he was deliberately coddled, understimulated, and overprotected. Physicians and theologians alike believed he was too fragile to be exposed to stress, criticism, or even intellectual challenge. They treated him like a holy relic, something to be preserved, not developed. Instead of teaching him how to adapt or cope with his condition, they made it worse by wrapping him in layers of deference and mysticism. And through it all, the court maintained its illusion. Ministers jockeyed for favor not by addressing the king directly, but by controlling access to him. The real power in Spain during his reign belonged to factions his mother's allies, his wives' families, foreign ambassadors. Charles's body was the throne room, but the decisions were made elsewhere. Spain was ruled by a whisper network of vested interests, a government built on ambiguity and ritual. In that sense, Charles was less of a monarch than a shrine revered, feared, and utterly powerless. Yet despite his condition, there are stories that hint at something deeper, that he had a sense of humor, albeit a limited one, that he enjoyed music, that he was gentle with animals and had a fondness for certain foods, particularly sweets. These details are small, but they matter. They remind us that even a life as burdened as Charles's had moments of personal texture, fleeting joys in a landscape of constraint. They don't redeem the system that produced his suffering, but they humanize the person who bore it. And if there's a single theme that emerges from his life, it's endurance. Charles endured, day after day, year after year. He showed up to the throne room. He attended mass. He held court. Even when his body was collapsing and his mind fraying, he let people dress him, feed him, medicate him, and pray over him, all while pretending he was still sovereign. He sat still while others discussed his soul. He signed documents he barely understood, and he endured. Endurance, especially in silence, is often mistaken for weakness, but there's another way to view it. Perhaps it was Charles's own form of rebellion. He never lashed out, never abdicated, never fled. He stayed. He didn't rule effectively, but he occupied a space the world had set for him and refused to vanish from it. And when the end finally came, it wasn't with a royal declaration. but with a body that simply couldn't carry the weight anymore. And yet, that body, so often the subject of fascination and pity, had done something no army or edict could do. It had held an empire together just long enough for a transition of power to be decided. Charles may not have understood the scale of what he triggered, but the fact remains. He didn't leave the succession question open. He made a choice, and in doing so, he gave Spain and Europe a direction, however bloody it turned out to be. That moment, more than anything else, feels like the soul of Charles II, quiet, slow, misunderstood but enduring, and, when it mattered most, decisive. It's easy to romanticize rulers who lead with brilliance and charisma. It's harder to appreciate those who simply remain, who hold on in the face of neglect, confusion, and decay. But Charles did. He held on longer than anyone thought possible. And in the end, he did what was expected of him, in the only way he could. That, perhaps, is the bitter truth of monarchy. Sometimes the most important thing a king can do is die. Charles's death triggered change. But his life, that was the cautionary tale. A mirror held up to an empire. A warning carved into flesh and bone. A slow unraveling in public view. We don't have to celebrate him, but we should remember him not as a curse, not as a punchline, but as a life. A life shaped by cruelty disguised as duty. A life that mattered, not because it was powerful, but because it endured long enough to show us what power, unchecked and unexamined, can do to the human soul. As the War of the Spanish Succession raged on, tearing through towns, sinking ships, and bankrupting treasuries, the man who started it all lay in a silent tomb beneath the royal monastery of El Escorial. Charles II's physical form, so closely monitored, examined, and whispered about in life, was now sealed in marble, no longer a subject of court gossip or medical curiosity. But the world around his resting place was unraveling. The irony, of course, was that Charles had died in hopes of preserving peace. He had named Philip of Anjou in his will specifically to avoid partitioning the Spanish Empire. He believed wrongly that this decision would prevent war, but his signature, shaky and feeble as it was, detonated the fragile balance of Europe. France accepted Philip as king. Austria, livid, claimed the Spanish crown for Archduke Charles. Britain, fearing French dominance, joined the fight. So did the Dutch, the Portuguese, and a dozen other opportunistic actors. What followed was not just a war of inheritance, it was a continental free-for-all. The cost of that conflict would be immense. Civilians suffered from famine and forced conscription. Economies buckled under the weight of prolonged military campaigns. Entire generations of young men were swallowed up in muddy fields from Flanders to Catalonia. And all of it, every cannon fired, every treaty violated, every family torn apart, stemmed from the legacy of one king who could barely hold a pen. It's hard to imagine that Charles truly grasped the stakes. Even if he was made aware of the precarious nature of Europe's balance of power, his ability to process and weigh outcomes was limited. But he did understand that his death would mark the end of the Habsburgs in Spain. That much was clear. He saw himself as the last thread in a golden tapestry frayed, fragile, but still holding the empire together. His will was an attempt to stitch that tapestry into a new design. The fact that it unraveled almost instantly is not entirely his fault, but it does reinforce a hard truth. When systems depend on symbols rather than functioning structures, their collapse is inevitable. And yet, in this chaos, Charles slowly began to shift in public memory. During the war, he was demonized by various factions. The Austrians painted him as a tragic fool. The French as a loyal martyr to Bourbon legitimacy. The British, always fans of irony, saw him as a cautionary joke. But over time, as blood dried and borders settled, those caricatures softened. In the decades after the Treaty of Utrecht ended the war, Charles became something stranger, a cultural myth. For some, he represented divine punishment, the wages of hubris and incest. For others, he was a symbol of martyrdom, a man used and discarded by the machinery of monarchy. And for still others, particularly in Spain, he became a symbol of lost grandeur, a king who, despite everything, held fast to Spain's independence until the very end. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries loved Charles. They cast him in poems, novels, operas. Painters rendered his image with Baroque theatricality, often exaggerating his deformities or, conversely, softening them into tragic beauty. He became a canvas for whatever moral lesson or political metaphor the artist needed. Degeneration, loyalty, superstition, or simply fate. In medical journals, Charles remained a fixture. His autopsy was quoted, debated, replicated. Entire studies were dedicated to the Habsburg jaw. And geneticists in the modern era still reference his case as a warning of the dangers of inbreeding. When DNA sequencing became advanced enough in the 21st century, researchers revisited the Habsburg family tree with renewed interest. The results were exactly what history had always hinted: a level of inbreeding so severe that Charles's gene pool was practically a closed loop. One researcher noted, rather clinically, that Charles II had as much genetic diversity as the child of full siblings. And if that fact doesn't make you pause, consider this: Charles's health problems weren't isolated. They were the accumulation of centuries of political matchmaking that treated women like currency, ignored basic science, and turned love into a transactional game of thrones. His body wasn't a tragedy, it was a spreadsheet rendered in flesh. And yet, despite all this, people continue to search for redemption in Charles's story. Perhaps it's because we want to believe that suffering means something, that the years he spent enduring, misunderstood and underestimated, weren't wasted, that his final decision, his act of choosing a successor, wasn't just a flicker of agency, but a spark of meaning in a life defined by silence. That search for meaning has led to some bizarre reinterpretations. Some nationalist writers in Spain have tried to reframe Charles as a misunderstood hero, a tragic but noble figure who fought against foreign interference until his dying breath. Others argue that his reign, though ineffective, at least kept Spain from falling completely under the sway of Austria or France. But most modern scholars are more restrained. They see Charles for what he was: a man born into an impossible situation, with neither the health nor the freedom to escape it. Still, that doesn't mean his life was without value. In fact, in a strange way, Charles's story may be more valuable because it forces us to confront things we'd rather ignore. The price of institutional inertia, the damage done when appearances matter more than outcomes, and the cruelty of defining people by what they represent instead of who they are. There's a lesson here for every institution that has ever protected its traditions at the expense of its people. Whether it's a royal family refusing to adapt, a company hiding behind legacy branding, or a government that props up figureheads while the real decisions happen in back rooms, the story of Charles II is a mirror held up to all of it. And what we see in that mirror depends on how honest we're willing to be. As for Charles himself, there are no monuments bearing long inscriptions of wisdom or speeches. His tomb bears his name and titles, but not his pain. That remains between the lines of history, waiting to be read not as a cautionary tale, but as a quiet request, to see him as he was, and to do better, because in the end, Charles II gave us more than a war and a warning. He gave us a question that still resonates today. What happens when a life is shaped entirely by expectations, and never by choice? If we can answer that not just for him, but for the people around us now, then maybe his life, however quiet and broken, won't have been in vain. The longer you sit with the story of Charles II, the more difficult it becomes to look away. Not because it's sensational, though there's plenty of that, but because it's hauntingly familiar in ways you don't expect. At first, you think you're reading about an odd king from a bygone age, trapped in a palace filled with incense and superstition. But then, slowly, you realize you're reading about every person who's ever been pushed into a role they didn't choose, every child born with expectations too heavy to carry, every system that kept rolling forward, even as the wheels ground down the people inside it. Charles didn't ask for any of it. Not the crown, not the condition, not the absurd weight of history pressing down on his frail shoulders. He didn't choose to be a symbol of decline, or a genetic anomaly, or the hinge on which all of Europe would turn. He was born into a game that had already decided his role, and the rules had been written centuries before he took his first breath. And yet, what makes his story compelling isn't just the tragedy, it's the slowness of it. Charles's life wasn't a dramatic fall from grace, like a general betrayed or a queen executed. It was a long, quiet erosion, year after year of being handled, not helped, prayed over, not spoken to, positioned, not partnered. The palace around him continued to function, but only by pretending he didn't need to. Ministers ruled in his name, wives smiled beside him, and everyone pretended the show was still real, even as the scenery crumbled around them. This slow decay had consequences far beyond the palace walls. Spain's economy during Charles's reign stagnated. Colonial governance deteriorated. Military readiness declined. But instead of confronting the root causes, the ruling elite blamed foreign influences, divine judgment, or the mysterious failings of a single monarch. Charles became the scapegoat for problems that had begun long before he was born and would continue long after he died. But to blame him is to miss the point. Charles wasn't an aberration, he was a product of decisions made over generations, of royal marriages arranged more for politics than for biology, of a church so embedded in power that it treated science as a threat. of courtiers and counselors who preferred ceremony to honesty. He was their reflection, distorted only because the mirror had already cracked. And this makes his endurance all the more remarkable. Because, despite the crushing expectations and physical limitations, Charles kept showing up. He showed up for ceremonies, even when standing made him tremble. He showed up for court, even when the words caught in his throat. He signed documents. He listened to advisors. He tried within the narrow confines allowed to him to act as king. This wasn't nobility in the romantic sense. It was quieter than that, almost invisible. But maybe that's what makes it meaningful. In a world that had reduced him to a symbol, Charles still tried to live as a person. Historians have often debated whether Charles was mentally competent. But what's rarely debated is the environment he was raised in, one designed not to nurture, but to shield him from stress, from truth, from challenge, from, in many ways, adulthood itself. And so even if he had possessed more capacity than people gave him credit for, he never had the chance to use it. His palace was his cradle, his court, his cage. There are rare accounts buried in diplomatic correspondence or letters from his tutors that suggest flashes of awareness. He reportedly expressed distress at the burden of succession. He asked why he could not father a child. He feared dying without leaving something behind. These were not the questions of a fool. They were the questions of a man who understood just enough to feel the weight of what he could never change. And when the end finally came, it was like the rest of his life, a performance for others. The dying king was attended by dozens of priests, chanting prayers, anointing his body, surrounding him in the theater of salvation. But what was happening inside his mind? Was he terrified? Relieved? Did he understand that the ceremony wasn't really for him, but for the people who needed to believe in a sacred death? One account from a courtier says Charles looked lost in his final hours, eyes flickering from face to face, as if searching for something he never found. Perhaps peace. Perhaps someone who wasn't afraid to tell him the truth. Or perhaps he wasn't searching at all. Perhaps he'd already accepted the final role given to him, the vessel through which history would end one story and begin another. And begin it did. His death set Europe on fire. Alliances shattered. Cities fell. Fortunes were made and lost. And Charles, once ignored in life, became essential in death. His name appeared in treaties, in war cries, in diplomatic speeches. His body was barely cold before the vultures descended to carve up his empire. In that sense, he did leave something behind, just not the kind of legacy he might have hoped for. But if we only remember him for the war that followed, we miss the most human parts of the story. The boy who was taught that his every breath was a divine mystery. The man who looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the face staring back. The husband who couldn't understand why his wives wept. The king who wanted to do good, but never learned how. Maybe that's why his story still lingers, not because it's dramatic, but because it's familiar. We've all known people like Charles. People placed in roles they weren't equipped for. People who were pitied instead of helped. People who were never told the truth because others thought they couldn't handle it. People whose lives are quietly tragic. Not because they failed, but because no one ever gave them a real chance. And so, we owe Charles something, not sympathy, exactly, but honesty. We owe him the dignity of seeing his life for what it was, not a royal farce, not a supernatural curse, but a deeply human struggle inside a system that valued blood over being. Because while Charles II may be buried beneath stone and gold, the questions he leaves behind are still alive. What makes a person valuable? Who decides what a life is worth? And how many people today, right now, are stuck in roles they never asked for, simply because the world around them won't change? Charles didn't change the world, but his life asks us if we will. As we near the end of Charles II's strange and painful journey, what lingers isn't the grandeur of monarchy or the shock of his deformities. It's the eerie stillness of missed potential. His life unfolded in slow motion, a careful choreography of avoidance. Avoid the truth. Avoid confrontation. Avoid reform. Everyone around him was trained to preserve the appearance of normalcy at all costs, even as his body and mind testified to a lineage stretched to its breaking point. And yet, Charles was not the one who failed Spain. Spain failed Charles. The rot had set in long before he was born, rooted in dynastic arrogance, religious inflexibility, and the stubborn refusal to adapt. Charles was simply the final fruit on a tree that had long since begun to decay. He inherited a kingdom exhausted by wars, choked by debt, and paralyzed by bureaucracy. His predecessors had built empires, yes, but they had also built cages. Cages of protocol, bloodline, and ceremonial power that left no room for imperfection. In that sense, Charles wasn't just trapped by his body, he was trapped by the very idea of what a king was supposed to be. There was never a moment in his life when he was allowed to be just a person. From birth, He was treated as both sacred and broken, revered and feared. Every glance in his direction carried with it a mixture of awe and pity. As a child, he was surrounded by nannies and confessors. As a teenager, by doctors and theologians, and as a man, by courtiers who spoke to him as if he were glass. No wonder he developed an unshakable dependence on religion. It was the only framework offered to him for understanding his suffering. He prayed constantly, confessed obsessively, and was surrounded by relics and symbols. He had to believe that his pain meant something, that his inability to produce an heir, his frequent illnesses, his incoherent speech, were part of a divine plan. If not, then what was it all for? What did it mean to be king, if not chosen by God? And yet even that comfort was fragile. When his health worsened, as it so often did, the whispers returned. He is cursed, a victim of sorcery, the work of a midwife with unclean hands. These were not metaphors. Exorcisms were performed in his chambers. Prayers were said not for his recovery, but for the removal of evil spirits. His own wife suspected he was under a hex. Imagine the psychological impact of that, being told, on one hand, that you are God's anointed, the spiritual cornerstone of a mighty empire, and on the other hand, that your body is a battlefield between heaven and hell, cursed from within. It's no surprise that Charles often seemed dazed, anxious, and unsure whom to trust. Who could he trust? Every gesture of support was tinged with fear, every act of kindness, with condescension. Yet despite it all, there were moments of connection, a smile here, a joke there. His affection for animals, especially dogs, is well documented. He reportedly took great comfort in their company, perhaps because they were among the few creatures that didn't look at him with dread or expectation. Dogs don't care about crowns. They just want to sit beside you. His relationship with his wives, though complex and strained, also held glimpses of humanity. Both women were unhappy. Yes, but there are accounts suggesting that Charles tried awkwardly, earnestly to be affectionate. He brought gifts. He asked after their health. When his first wife died, he was inconsolable for days. Was it love? Perhaps not in the grand romantic sense, but it was feeling, and it was real. In a life so heavily managed, even small emotions became acts of defiance. And then there's the will, that single document, scrawled in shaky ink, that changed the course of history. People often analyze it for its political implications, choosing Philip of Anjou over the Austrian claimant, risking war, reshaping alliances. But if you read it closely, it's also strangely personal. Charles didn't just name a successor. He expressed wishes for peace, unity, and the preservation of his empire. He wanted his people to be safe. He wanted his country to survive him. He wanted, in some small way, to matter. And that's the quiet heartbeat beneath all the pageantry and dysfunction. Charles wanted to matter. He didn't crave power. He never knew what to do with it. He craved meaning. A legacy, something more than whispers and pity. And while he may never have achieved greatness in the traditional sense, his life continues to echo because it forces us to ask difficult questions about leadership, about systems, and about how we treat those who don't fit the mold. What if Charles had been born into a different family? What if he'd been allowed to live as a private citizen, far from court, free from crowns and curses? What if he'd had access to the kind of education and medical care that could have given him a chance to understand himself? Could he have been a writer, a monk, a gardener? Could he have lived a quiet life, filled with small joys and companionship? We'll never know. And perhaps that's the saddest part, not what happened, but what never could. Because while most kings are remembered for what they did, Charles is remembered for what was done to him. His reign was not a series of decisions, but a slow unraveling. His court was not a center of power, but a theater of denial. His crown was not a reward, but a burden. And yet, through it all, he remained, he endured, and in his final act naming a successor, choosing a future, he carved a sliver of agency into a life that had rarely allowed him any. That should mean something. In the end, Charles II stands not as a failure, but as a mirror, not a warning about inbreeding or superstition or weak monarchs. Though it is all those things, he is a mirror that reflects the cost of systems that cannot change, institutions that prioritize legacy over humanity, and societies that value symbols more than souls. And as long as those systems exist, so will new Charles is quiet, confused, and carrying the weight of others' expectations. Unless, of course, unless we finally listen to the silence behind the stories. Because buried in that silence is a man who never got to speak for himself. It's not too late to hear him. By now, Charles II has likely become more than a historical figure in your mind. He's an image, thin, pale, eyes darting nervously in candlelight, weighed down by robes too grand for his frame. Or perhaps you see him in another way, as a symbol not of royalty, but of everything that goes wrong when people are reduced to roles they can never fulfill. Either way, his story lingers. And it should, because it doesn't end with his death, or even with the war his passing unleashed. His legacy is still echoing, quietly, insistently, in every corner of power where tradition is protected at the expense of truth. You don't have to believe in destiny or divine right to understand that Charles II never had a chance. From the moment he was conceived, his life was dictated by decisions made centuries before. His genes were a cocktail of ambition and denial, passed down through generations of Habsburgs who believed bloodlines were more sacred than health, more essential than humanity. Every cousin who married another cousin, every union made to secure a treaty rather than a future, contributed to the slow, silent disaster that was Charles's life. And when that life finally ended quietly, beneath a ceiling of gold leaf and whispered prayers, it left a Europe reeling. But as dramatic as the geopolitical fallout was, it's the personal fallout that continues to resonate. Because Charles II is not just a relic of royal excess. He's a case study in what happens when we forget to see people as people. Even now, centuries later, how often do we build systems that reward the image over the individual? How many institutions still prioritize heritage, loyalty, or appearance, while ignoring capacity, well-being, and truth? Charles may have been a king in an age of incense and relics, but his life feels uncomfortably modern. Substitute the palace for a boardroom, the crown for a last name, and the court for an executive committee. And suddenly you're not talking about the past anymore. You're talking about now. And yet, for all his flaws, for all the dysfunction that surrounded him, Charles was not the villain of his story, nor was he a fool, or a figure to be mocked. He was, in every real sense, a victim of expectations he couldn't meet, of rituals he couldn't escape, of decisions made in rooms he never entered. His suffering wasn't metaphorical, it was physical, emotional, spiritual, and the people around him, instead of helping, built a wall of velvet and marble and silence. But Charles did something remarkable in the face of all that. He endured. He didn't rebel. He didn't abdicate. He didn't lash out at the world that failed him. He endured, quietly, patiently, for 38 long years. And when the time came, he made his final choice, not a dramatic gesture, not a speech, but a will, a few names on a page that would tear Europe apart. Some might say it was his last failure. Others, that it was his only act of real agency. Either way, it was his. And maybe that's what makes his story so compelling, because even the most fragile among us still long to choose, still long to be seen, still long to leave something behind that was truly theirs. In the centuries since Charles's death, his story has been twisted and simplified. In cartoons, he's the drooling king. In textbooks, a symbol of decline. In genetic studies, a cautionary tale. But so rarely is he treated with the one thing he never had enough of: compassion. What would it mean to remember Charles with empathy, not irony? To teach his story not as a freak show, but as a human tragedy with lessons still urgently relevant. To stop staring at his jaw and start listening to the silence around him, the silence of a life lived without choice. Because he wasn't the only one. The palace halls were filled with people like him, servants whose names we'll never know, courtiers whose careers were built on pretending everything was fine, a mother who alternated between fierce protection and religious panic, wives who were married off to a man they didn't understand and couldn't escape, and a king sitting in the middle of it all, clutching at rosaries and trying to make sense of it. Charles's story is a reminder that systems can outlive their usefulness, but still demand loyalty, that traditions can become prisons, that institutions, left unexamined, can consume the very people they were meant to protect. His life was a slow-motion implosion, but one that everyone saw coming and no one dared stop. And so here we are, 300 years later, still talking about him, still drawing lessons from his pain, still trying to decide what kind of man he really was. The truth is, we'll never fully know. The records are incomplete, the perspective's biased, the silence is deafening. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to make sure no one else has to live like he did. Maybe the point is to build systems that see people truly see them before it's too late. Charles II was not a great king. He wasn't even a good king, by most measures, but that doesn't mean his life was meaningless. In fact, it may be one of the most important stories the Spanish crown and all monarchies, all governments, all institutions ever produced, because in his broken body and quiet desperation lies a warning more powerful than any royal decree. Do not mistake legacy for legitimacy. Do not assume that tradition will carry you where compassion will not. And never forget that the people behind the titles, behind the roles, behind the history books as are just that people, Charles II of Spain is gone. His line ended. His empire fractured. His memory faded and misremembered. But the questions he left behind remain, and they are ours to answer. So if you find yourself in a place of power, or responsibility, or even just influence, ask yourself, are you building something that sees the person, or something that will one day turn someone into Charles? Because history doesn't repeat. We do. Let's choose better.